This is the Q&A podcast with your host, Peter Slen. Thanks for joining us. Starting shortly is an interview and conversation about James Baldwin. Nicholas Boggs is our guest, and his new book is titled Baldwin, A Love Story. 5 months before his death in 1987, at age 63, James Baldwin lamented that it's a shame that it takes so long to learn so little. And for a man who spent his life learning and striving, that was a real regret. Not only an influential bestseller of books such as Go Tell It on the Mountain, Giovanni's Room, and The Fire Next Time, Baldwin was an active and forceful influence in the civil rights movement. A true original thinker, James Baldwin's influence as an author and activist is still felt today. Nicholas Boggs spent over 20 years researching and writing his 700-page biography of Baldwin, and Mr. Boggs shares with us his conclusions, research, and what he has learned, beginning now.
Nicholas Boggs, what should we know about James Baldwin?
Well, I said this recently a bunch, but I think he's the most important writer of the 20th century. I think that's the first thing that you have to know about him, having witnessed the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, gay liberation, having lived internationally on several continents. He witnessed the world and through many, many tumultuous changes. So his ability to capture that in words as a witness makes him, I believe, the most important writer of the 20th century.
Was he an original thinker?
He was the original thinker, yes, in terms of really thinking about the intersections. We have a term for that now because of the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality. But he really was one of the first to really think about race, gender, sexuality, nation, capitalism, colonialism, all the isms, to think about them together in subtle and nuanced ways.
What was the impact of his writing in his contemporary times?
It was massive. Probably the biggest moment was in the early 60s with the publication of The Fire Next Time in the New Yorker, and then as a book. That's when he landed on the cover of Time magazine. He had a massive, massive reach. His novel that came out around that time in another country was a bestseller. So he was reaching, a wide, wide public, both in the United States and then internationally. So his kind of approach to, he wrote that Black and white Americans must come together like lovers in order to see each other and change the world, had a massive, massive impact on the civil rights movement.
So throughout his career, he was well known in his time?
He was very well known. His career had an arc, like many do, where he hit sort of a high point in terms of his popularity in the 60s, but he was still writing into the 70s and the 80s. His novel, If Beale Street Could Talk, which became a film a few years ago, came out in 1973. He was publishing important essays in Playboy in the last couple of years of his life. So he was still a best-selling author. Anything that he did was news, even if there was this unfortunate narrative of decline that hit him in the later parts of his career.
Mr. Boggs, 700 pages, 20 years. It took you to write Baldwin, A Love Story. Why so much time?
Well, in part because I never set out to write a biography. In fact, when I got the book contract to write a biography, I'd never read a biography from start to finish. I set out to bring this children's book by Baldwin back into print called Little Man, A Story of Childhood that I discovered in college in the 90s. And through the process of researching that book, I began to see that there were gaps in Baldwin's life story and thus in how we sort of understood his creative process and his significance as a writer. So it really wasn't until 2017 when the amazing Schomburg archives became available and Little Man came out, the new edition in 2018, that I realized what I had been actually researching for a couple decades at that point was a new biography.
Well, and of course, Schomburg is the New York Public Library in Harlem. What happened in 2017 that archives became available?
Well, the Baldwin estate made a transfer to the Schomburg, which was a boon for the world, especially anybody interested in James Baldwin. These are incredibly voluminous archives that I had the privilege of spending time with as a fellow, as a scholar in residence at the Schomburg. This contains everything from drafts of novels and essays to letters to fan letters to business records. So it's really, I actually don't know if there are many American writers out there, and particularly Black American writers out there, where we have access to such an incredibly large archive.
Did you have hesitation about being a white man writing about a black writer?
I would say that I did, but because the process was so gradual that I became the biographer, it wasn't like I woke up one day or FSG woke up one day and said, "You need to write this biography." By the time I took on the project, I had already published widely about Baldwin in academic journals. I had already brought Little Man back into print with my co-editor, Jennifer DeVere Brody, with Duke. So I'd had sort of a lifetime of commitment to this project. And there is a long history of responsible white authors writing about important black figures. Think of David Blight and others. So there were models for me. It was important that one be comfortable discussing this. There's a long history of white appropriation or erasure of black stories. So if you're going to be a white biographer of a black subject, you have to be ready to talk about it.
Nicholas Boggs, what was it about Little Man, that attracted you?
Well, I had read James Baldwin growing up in Washington, D.C., and in the D.C. public schools, actually. But when I got to college, I took a class where we read everything written by him, except for this book. This was 1996, and David Leeming's incredibly important biography. David Leeming was Baldwin's friend and personal assistant and wrote a 1994 biography of Baldwin. And I read it. Well, I didn't read it from cover to cover, but I read the index and at that point. And there were only a couple paragraphs about Little Man, and this French artist named Joran Kazak. So I went to the Beinecke where the book was, and it was such a strange and beautiful book. It was written in Black English. It was a children's book for an adult and an adult's book for children. So it was really unlike anything I'd ever seen, and it was mysterious to me, as was the relationship behind it. In the biography that Leeming wrote, he mentions that what sounds like they may have been lovers or collaborators or just collaborators, it's hard to tell. So I wrote the first email of my life to David Leeming asking him about Joran Kazak, and this sent me off on a journey where Leeming thought he was dead, as everyone did, but it turns out that he was actually alive, and I went to meet him in 2003 in Paris.
Was James Baldwin out during his lifetime?
That's such an interesting question. He gave a really important interview to the Village Voice editor, Richard Goldstein, late in his life in the 80s. And he dances around this subject. In some ways, Baldwin, strategically, I believe, rejected all categories. He rejected black, white, gay, straight, male, female, because he really understood that these definitions were the sort of the tool of the oppressor to kind of contain and delimit and define the so-called other. This doesn't mean that he wasn't, for example, a very proud member of the black community, that didn't love black people, black literature, etc. He loved jazz, he loved the blues. He understood the importance of black history, but he refused to let these definitions define him. Something kind of similar was going on when it came to gay identity. But it's for himself, but it's also the case, and I explore this a lot in the book, as he said in this interview, the word gay wouldn't have meant anything to my lovers. And this was true because most of his lovers were predominantly heterosexual men who were married to women eventually and had children with them. Baldwin often became the godfather to these children. So his rejection of the term gay was both a personal thing for himself, but also a descriptive of the kinds of complicated, unusual, but really sustaining relationships that he had throughout his life.
Mr. Boggs, were you able to determine how many books James Baldwin sold during his lifetime and how much money he made?
Oh, that's a new question. I actually do not know that. Money with Baldwin is a fascinating subject, though, because he was, notoriously bad at managing his money. When he had it, he would borrow money from people like Marlon Brando, or quote unquote borrow. But he would also give money away to people in need, including people who weren't so nice to him, like Eldridge Cleaver, for example. So money was something that there's a scholar, Jacqueline Goldsby, right now, who's writing a book, I believe, which I'm really interested in, about Baldwin's business records and about Baldwin and money. So this is a subject that will be explored closely in the coming months and years.
Why did he have a 2,000-page FBI file?
Yeah, so when I graduated from college, well, actually my junior year in college, I was a research assistant for a professor. This was in 1996, and I went through the entirety of those files. And William Maxwell has written a couple really important books about those files. He had those files like Richard Wright did, like Malcolm X, like Martin Luther King, because he was deemed by Hoover in particular as a real, well, Hoover had an almost voyeuristic interest in Baldwin, which we can get into, but mostly because Baldwin's sort of involvement with perceived involvement with the Nation of Islam, which wasn't real. He wrote about going to meet Elijah Muhammad in The Fire Next Time, and that really set Hoover off. But the FBI files, they followed him everywhere. There's a lot of misinformation, but the one incredibly useful thing about these files for a biographer is that they were very good about tracking his airplane flights. So when I needed to know where he was, whether he was in Istanbul and when he flew to London and when he flew back to the States, I do have the FBI files to thank for that, but just for that.
Well, just some information about James Baldwin, born in Harlem in 1924, died in France in 1987. Here's a partial bibliography. Go Tell It on the Mountain came out in 1953. Notes of a Native Son, 1955. Giovanni's Room, 1956. Another Country, 62. The Fire Next Time, 1963. Just Above My Head in 1979. And The Evidence of Things Not Seen came out in 1985. Of all those books, The Fire Next Time is the one that he is remembered most for?
I would say so. It remains a canonical text of race relations, in the 20th century. But Another Country was also a bestseller. Giovanni's Room is legendary as a groundbreaking work of gay literature, even though he wouldn't have called it that. Notes of a Native Son, his first collection, I mean, that's really aged very well. And that's the thing about Baldwin's work. It ages well. So what is considered the most important book in his lifetime can shift later on. No Name in the Street, his 1972 essay book, which is really where he goes back and examines his life, but he also examines the failures of the civil rights movement. A new generation of young readers in particular, thanks in part to Eddie Glaude's book, have really picked that book up. His final novel, Just Above My Head. Contemporary novelists like Robert Jones, John Keene, are celebrating this sort of Black queer novel as Baldwin's perhaps literary masterpiece. So you have to kind of think about different time periods and different communities and how they're taking up different books as the most important one for them.
Nicholas Boggs, of the books we mentioned, were many of them bestsellers at the time?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Another Country, bestseller. The Fire Next Time, bestseller. If Beale Street Could Talk, bestseller, even though it got mixed reviews. People read James Baldwin. Anything he did was news. When he was putting a play, Blues for Mr. Charlie on Broadway in the 60s, that was news. When he came back to the States in 1979 with Just Above My Head, that was news. It was also news that it was not news. And I'll tell you why. For example, there's that famous story of a 2020 segment that was not aired in 1979. Incredible footage of Baldwin in his family home on West 71st Street. His mother is there. But he sang quite damning things about the state of America and the treatment of Black Americans at that point. It was not aired, it was said, this is what the producer was told, because nobody cared about a Black gay has-been. Similar thing happened when Henry Louis Gates interviewed Baldwin and Josephine Baker in the 70s in the south of France. Time magazine didn't run it because they said Baldwin was quote unquote passé. But he wasn't passé. He really had his finger on the pulse of what was happening in the country at the time.
Well, some of his contemporaries include Lorraine Hansberry, Raisin in the Sun, Richard Wright, Native Son, Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. How are his relationships with these Black authors?
Well, very complicated. I would say, except for the case of Lorraine Hansberry, they were incredibly close. It's one thing that I try to look at in my book is not just his key relationships with these men that I structure the book through, but also his close relationships with women like Lorraine Hansberry, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou. But Lorraine Hansberry in particular, really, she was further to the left, more of a socialist than Baldwin. So she really pushed him on his politics. But even more than that, I would say she influenced his desire or his ability to imagine that he could be a playwright. I mean, seeing Raisin in the Sun was a huge moment for him. She attended an actor's studio workshop rendition of Giovanni's Room that never actually made it to the stage. But she was a dear, dear friend of his, and perhaps most importantly, historically, they were together in that incredible meeting with RFK before the Voting Rights Act, before the Civil Rights Act, trying to convince the president to have a moral response to what was happening in the South and the North. But so Lorraine Hansberry was a very close friend. Richard Wright was a kind of interesting story. Baldwin met him when he was very young in the Village, and they had a friend in common. He went out to see him in Brooklyn, and they drank some bourbon together. And he told Wright that he had written this whole novel that he hadn't written because they got a little bit drunk. And Wright was very interested, so Baldwin had to go back and quickly write the 60 pages he said he'd written. Wright helped him get a fellowship. Wright moved to Paris before he did, and actually was very nice to him when he first arrived. But then Baldwin wrote a couple essays, including Everybody's Protest novel, that were not very kind to Wright. Baldwin said that he used it as a springboard for his own work. He actually called their relationship kind of Oedipal. He said he had to slay his father. So that was a complicated relationship, in part because Wright was probably not entirely comfortable with Baldwin's sexuality either. Ralph Ellison, Baldwin really admired Invisible Man, but there's correspondence between Wright and Ellison saying sort of pretty unkind things about Baldwin's sexuality. So at that point in history, there was this pernicious narrative that there could only be one famous black writer. So that triumvirate, Baldwin, Wright, Ellison, in a way, they were kind of fighting over that position. And for a while, Baldwin is the person who came out sort of on top.
Go Tell It on the Mountain came out in 1953, and Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man did as well. And Ralph Ellison won the National Book Award for that book, didn't he?
He did, and I love that novel. That's a tremendous novel. Of course, it's the only novel that he wrote that was published. He's written some, I think, underrated essays as well. But Baldwin and Ellison were very, very different. I mean, perhaps the biggest difference between them, in addition to the output, is that Baldwin got very, very involved in the civil rights movement in a way that Ellison really didn't. I mean, Baldwin was really transformed by his first visit to the American South in 1957, and by encouragement of other important figures like Sterling Brown. So Baldwin really, even though he, similarly to Ellison, he really saw himself as an artist. He saw himself as a novelist and wanted to focus on that. Unlike Ellison, he willingly got caught up in the tide of the civil rights movement and became an important political voice.
Nicholas Boggs, did James Baldwin write about people he knew or met?
Absolutely. And one of the things that made my job a little bit easier as a biographer is that, there are some fiction writers, many of my friends and my partner, who, sometimes we might be coy about the relationship between autobiography and fiction. Oh no, it's not based on my life, for example. But Baldwin wasn't like that. In interviews, he'd say, "Oh yeah, John in Go Tell on the Mountain is based on myself. In Giovanni's Room, there are aspects of David and Giovanni that he draws on. Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone is a novel that's very autobiographical. He sort of changes himself into an actor instead of a famous writer." So Baldwin was not coy about that, and so absolutely. What's interesting to track, though, in his fiction is when it is that things change, right? He's not writing just about himself. He's transforming himself into somebody else and the people around him as well. I'll give you one example. If Beale Street Could Talk, this is in some ways a classic black love story set in Harlem. There's an falsely incarcerated man who's engaged to Tish, black woman who's pregnant and is the narrator of that novel. Now, this is a story about the black family, about the quest for black liberation, but it's also dedicated to Joran Kazak, who Baldwin was having a relationship with at that point. So it's in a sense based on his interracial queer relationship with a white man, but it's refracted into this black heterosexual love story. Baldwin did this. He understood that the material of his life could be used in all kinds of different ways, and he wasn't going to be limited in how he drew on his own life.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment.
You quote in your book, James Baldwin, "I never had a childhood. I did not have human identity. I was born dead." Where did that come from?
That was an interview with a French journalist late in his life. He was well in the 70s, in the period, I believe, when he was actually working on Little Man, the children's book, which is interesting because that's in part, I think, why it's called a children's book for an adults and an adult's book for children. Listen, Baldwin was the first of 9 kids, growing up impoverished in Harlem. He really was a second parent. I mean, his father was working incredibly hard in a soda factory. His mother was also working very hard as a housekeeper. So Baldwin really raised his siblings and was also working a part-time job at a sweatshop after school. So when he says he didn't have a childhood, I think that's what he means. But I think he's also in this talking about the ways that Black children are often denied the kinds of freedoms, right, and the kind of access to the childhood that their white counterparts are. This is something that he explored in Little Man, Little Man. He was showing the pleasures and the dangers and the possibilities and the constraints that these children had. It's a children's book for adults because it explores things like police brutality, police surveillance, drug addiction. So it was a children's book for adults in that way. So he was being maybe a little bit hyperbolic by saying he didn't have a childhood, but what he meant was that he didn't have the kind of childhood that he hoped that his nieces and nephews would have, which they did, in fact. And that's part of why he dedicated Little Man, to them.
So he was born in 1924 in Harlem. Did the Harlem Renaissance, the writers of that age, of the 20s and 30s, have an impact on him?
Somewhat obliquely, I would say. Fascinatingly, his English teacher in junior high school was Countee Cullen, really important poet of the Harlem Renaissance, who had spent time on a Guggenheim in Paris. So part of, I think, what inspired Baldwin to go to Paris eventually was the impact of Countee Cullen. Countee Cullen is also the one who had gone to DeWitt Clinton High School, a magnet high school, and Baldwin went there, and that's where Baldwin met and became friends with people like Richard Avedon. So he was influenced by Countee Cullen for sure. Buford Delaney was his spiritual father, important Black American painter who eventually followed Baldwin to Paris. Delaney had moved to Harlem from Boston, but originally from Knoxville, Tennessee, in part to join the Harlem Renaissance. But by the time he came there, it was sort of on its tail end. So Baldwin was growing up, I would say, in the shadow of the Harlem Renaissance, but influenced by people like Delaney and Countee Cullen.
James Baldwin, 24 years old. The year is 1948. How well known was he before he left for Paris that year?
He was not very well known at all, but he had written a few short pieces for places like The Reporter, smaller publications, but he hadn't really hit it big. You know, as I mentioned before, it sort of was with the publication of Everybody's Protest novel that people started. That was published in Zero, and then it was published back in the States as well. That's really when he landed. It was Go Tell It on the Mountain, however, where he really became, a well-known figure with the publication of his first novel. And then, Giovanni's Room, people sometimes forget, was a finalist for the National Book Award, actually, a few years later. So his fame was steadily climbing after he moved to Paris, I would say, and really took off, with The Fire Next Time.
Yeah, there was really a Black American diaspora in Paris, wasn't there?
Josephine Baker had gone over years before. Richard Wright went over, and Baldwin followed him. There were a lot of jazz and blues musicians who went over there as well. So yes, this was a place where Black Americans felt that they had some measure of freedom. Sometimes it can be, I think, romanticized or idealized. There was racism and is racism in France, particularly. The Algerians experienced it, and Baldwin would write about that. But for Baldwin, going places like France and later Istanbul wasn't just about this romantic notion of freedom, but also this kind of linguistic alienation that he needed in order to write. So he famously talks about how he couldn't speak French at first. And that was helpful because it was ironically, being away from his own country, that he had the distance to reflect back on it. But also, when he wrote his first novel, he took Bessie Smith records with him, with his partner, lover at the time, Lucian, to a Swiss chalet. Listening to Bessie Smith as the only black person for miles in this small village, ironically, that's when he was able to kind of reconnect, as he put it, with the language of his childhood and find the novels, both characters as they needed to be articulated, but also, most importantly, I think, the voice of the novel.
Mr. Boggs, you've mentioned Lucian Happersberger a couple of times. What's their backstory?
So Lucian Happersberger moved to Paris, much like Baldwin had, to find himself as an artist, in his case, a painter, about a year after Baldwin did. And they met. Baldwin had just gotten out of prison, actually. He wrote his excellent essay, Equal in Paris, about being thrown in prison because of a so-called stolen bed sheet that he hadn't stolen, but a friend acquaintance of his had. He was telling this story, which has both pathos and humor, at a gay bar called La Reine Blanche, and everybody was surrounding him, and he noticed this handsome, shaggy-haired young man, and they hit it off immediately. And they became lifelong friends, but also intermittently lovers. Baldwin called him the love of my life. He dedicated Giovanni's Room to him. As I mentioned, it was Lucian who took him to his family's Swiss chalet where he wrote his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. He also became Baldwin's business manager for a time, but it was a dramatic relationship. Lucian, when his play, Blues for Mr. Charlie, was on Broadway, his friend Diana Sands, the great actress, was in it, and Lucian stole her away and ended up marrying her. So it was a dramatic relationship in many ways, but Lucian is the one who returned to Baldwin's bedside in the south of France and was with him when he died. So incredibly complex, incredibly layered, incredibly crucial and important relationship for understanding Baldwin's life, but also his creative process.
What was the role of Mary Painter in his life? Was she a sponsor?
That's one way of looking at her. I think that he would probably call her his best friend. They met. She was a brilliant economist, educated at Swarthmore, involved in the Marshall Plan, fascinating figure in her own right. They met at a brunch in Paris and hit it off immediately. And yes, she would sponsor him with money and certainly with whiskey. I think she had access to some tariff-free whiskey, American whiskey or something. So they became kind of a threesome, a triumvirate with Lucian. They'd sit around listening to Mahalia Jackson records at Mary's apartment. What she really became, I think, most importantly, in addition to being a dear friend, was a kind of an epistolary lifeline, is what I call her, because he wrote to her from many travels. From his first trip south, his first couple of trips south, he wrote to her of the terror he experienced seeing the burning crosses. He wrote to her from Corsica. He wrote to her. She actually saved his life, as he put it once when he tried to commit suicide. He called her immediately, and she came over and made him throw up the pills. So he once said, if I could have married, he realized that if he couldn't marry Mary Painter, then he could marry no woman. So she was more than a friend. She was, and this is something that I explore throughout the book. Baldwin had these immensely important kinship structures that he structured throughout, Istanbul and Paris and the south of France. He was very close to his family back in the States, but you have to remember that he spent the large bulk of his life abroad, and he needed these kinds of relationships to create havens where he could create his work and escape from kind of the pressures of the civil rights movement, the FBI surveillance, and so forth.
So from about 1948 to 57, that was Baldwin's Paris period. Was he productive, and was he disciplined in his writing?
Well, he was very disciplined, and very productive. I mean, that's when his career really took off, but he'd have to leave Paris in order to write most of the time. He made these 3 extended trips. One in particular was months long, into the Swiss village to finish Go Tell It on the Mountain. And then when he started working, he wrote parts of Giovanni's Room in several places. And another country he started to work on in Corsica for 7 months. So he would go back and forth to Paris, but I would say that he was most productive when he was elsewhere. Paris was a place of making contacts, of gaining experience, of sort of finding freedom, but he actually had to go elsewhere throughout his life in order to write.
Now, your publisher is Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. Who was his?
Knopf was his first publisher of Go Tell It on the Mountain, but then they would famously or infamously would not publish Giovanni's Room. They wanted him to write another book like Go Tell It on the Mountain. They thought that he was destroying his career, and Baldwin famously and bravely said, "Okay, I'm gonna go back over to England," and he sold it there to Michael Joseph. And then Dial Press in the States, who became his longtime publisher after that, decided that it was safe to publish Giovanni's Room. So he had several different publishers over the course of his career. A lot of interesting stories would happen where he would sort of not threaten, but tried to leave in order to levy the kinds of support that he felt his work truly deserved. Richard Merrick, who was his editor later in his life, who I interviewed, tells some funny stories about a funny story about going over to the south of France in the 70s and meeting up with Baldwin and trying to convince him to stay with Dial Press. And Baldwin, they drink a bottle of wine in Nice, and they talk about Dostoevsky. And at some point, Baldwin is sort of writes on a napkin and gives it to Richard Merrick, and it says, when Black Americans take over New York, just show them this napkin. And it says free pass, so that he'd be safe. So Baldwin was messing with him, but actually they really hit it off, and Baldwin ended up staying with Dial Press. But he also ended up getting the money that he required.
Was he known to his friends as Jimmy?
Absolutely. He was known to his dear friends as Jimmy. Some family members, I think, called him Jamie. But Jimmy was what his friends called him. Jimmy is what David Leeming, his important first biographer, called him. I, of course, did not know him, so I refer to him as Baldwin throughout the book. But Jimmy, yes, his collection of poetry is called Jimmy's Blues. So yes, Jimmy was the name that his close friends and intimates called him.
And I'm being a little facetious here, but I don't think a picture exists of James Baldwin without a cigarette and a glass of scotch.
There are a few, but I think if we were going to capture Baldwin in his happy place, it would probably be sitting at what he called the welcome table. That's this table that he had in the south of France, where everybody from Marlon Brando to Maya Angelou to Harry Belafonte to Josephine Baker would come and visit him. And he would probably be sitting there with scotch and a cigarette, chatting away with his loved ones.
A couple of French that he befriended included Edith Piaf and Jean-Paul Sartre, correct?
No, he didn't really befriend Sartre. In fact, when he first arrived in France, Wright had been sitting at a table with Sartre, and Sartre left before Baldwin came. So no, I don't think they really became close. Edith, he was a big fan of hers, and he interviewed her and wrote about her, and was thrilled about that. I don't know if they exactly became friends. Simone Signoret became a very good friend of his. That's for sure.
Would we classify James Baldwin today as an alcoholic?
Well, I think it's difficult to look back at in anachronistically used terms, but in terms of his mental health as well, and Buford Delaney also, I think it'd be interesting to get sort of clinical takes. It's not for me to kind of brand him in those ways, but he certainly had his struggles. Early on, this was from very early on. In his early years in Paris, he was walking with a friend by an AA meeting. He thought, "Oh, should we go in there?" And they went in, and it was a bunch of stuffy-looking people in suits. And Baldwin said, "Let's go back to the bar." So this was a struggle for him, and it was really part of his creative process. He would often stay up late drinking with friends, and then they'd go to bed, and he would write all night long until the birds started singing. So he lived a very, very rough life in that sense. So he certainly was reliant on alcohol as part of his creative process, as many, many writers were during that period.
Mr. Boggs, why did James Baldwin come back to the States in '57 or so?
Well, he had been in Corsica trying to write Another Country, and he'd gone through a really big breakup, and he had once again contemplated suicide. This time he had gone out into the water taking his shoes off. He thought of Virginia Woolf. And he sort of realized, as he often did when he's on the edge of despair and the edge of these kinds of moments, he had a kind of epiphany that he realized like he had to write in another country. And he realized that, he had to go back to the States. He also had a couple assignments from Harper's and elsewhere to go down south. I think Sterling Brown had also been really encouraging him. Sterling Brown was somebody that he had a lot of respect for. And Sterling Brown had said, you are a great writer, but there's a lot happening back here in this country. And if you need to be in France to write, that's fine, but you should come back. And so he came back for those assignments, but he came back because he began to understand increasingly that he was, as he put it, a witness, not just a novelist, not just an artist, but also a witness to his times.
Where did he write The Fire Next Time?
He actually wrote most of that in Istanbul. So the story of how he ended up in Istanbul is really important. Magdalena Zaborowska is a scholar who's written a very important book a couple decades ago now, but a really important book about his decade. He really spent most of the 60s in Istanbul. He called it his home. He considered it a place of refuge and respite. He went there for the first time in 1961, directly from Israel. He was following his friend Engin Cezar, who became a very famous Turkish actor. He'd met him in the Greenwich Village, kind of had a big crush on him. He followed him there, and within a few weeks, he was able to crack the code and finish Another Country. He finished it at a party. And he realized that this was where he could actually write. So he'd go back to the States for the March on Washington. He'd go back for kind of, to work with CORE. He'd go back for these really draining involvements in the civil rights movement. And then he'd get to Istanbul and he would be embraced by these Turkish and expat artists, writers, activists. And once again, he didn't know the language. So he had this linguistic alienation that fueled his art. And he was able to reflect back on America. So he wrote most of that incredible essay in Istanbul.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment.
Well, it came out in 1963, and it was the best-selling book of the year, or one of the best-selling books of the year. 1963 was the same year as the Medgar Evers assassination, JFK assassination, the March on Washington, the Birmingham church bombing, and, as you mentioned, the May 1963 meeting between civil rights leaders and Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General at the time. Recently, Peniel Joseph, in his book about 1963, talked about that meeting. Here's a little bit of Professor Joseph.
Bobby Kennedy asked James Baldwin to organize a meeting of civil rights activists who are cultural figures, people like Harry Belafonte, people like Lena Horne, Baldwin's friend Lorraine Hansberry. These activists, led by Baldwin, but certainly Jerome Smith, tell him that the administration is not doing enough, that they are dissatisfied, that the administration is not recognizing Black humanity and citizenship to the degree that the crisis demands. And he's really gobsmacked. He's taken aback.
Is he defensive?
He's super defensive, and no group of Black people, at least, have ever spoken to him this way.
Mr. Boggs, the impact of that May 63 meeting with RFK.
Well, first of all, I love that book. I think that book is an excellent example of how a kind of focused, microscopic look at 1 year can really tell us so much about Baldwin, but also about America at that time. So I'm really glad you brought that up. That meeting, is, I believe, being turned into a couple different plays right now. I mean, it's such almost mythical meeting now because I think only one person is still alive who attended it. There are all kinds of different versions of that, of accounts of that meeting. What interested me in my approach was the fact that it was, hard to tell whether how intentional Baldwin was with how he approached this meeting, because the day of it, he'd actually been interviewed by Louis Funke, who was the drama critic at the New York Times, to talk about Blues for Mr. Charlie, which he was working on, which was going to be on Broadway. That was news. But at the end of that interview, Baldwin snuck it in that he had this meeting that it was supposed to be, secret. And I believe that he did that sort of intentionally, that he wanted word to get out because he wanted to pressure the administration through this meeting. And it's part of why he chose people like Lena Horne, who flew all the way from California, and Harry Belafonte, sort of high profile celebrities whose presence in this meeting would be news. So what actually happened is that Louis Funke asked Baldwin, well, can I tell my colleagues at the New York Times? He did. And it was Lamon Robinson, one of the few Black reporters at the New York Times at that point, who ended up writing the account of that meeting in kind of precisely the ways I believe that Baldwin hoped he would. There was, instead of these sort of menacing photos of Baldwin, there was a smiling, beautiful photo of Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry, and Lena Horne. But they were saying really important things about the moral failures of the country. James Reston then came out, a white journalist of the New York Times, same newspaper, came out with a much more negative account where he called Jerome Smith, sort of the freedom fighter who was sort of very vociferous in the meeting. He called him a savage. So in a way, Baldwin got just what he wanted. He got these differing accounts that showed to the American people that that they were being listened to in that meeting, but they also weren't. And I believe that it really played a key role in the president making some changes and eventually the Civil Rights Act.
So it's 1963. Baldwin's on a book tour for The Fire Next Time. Is he combining that with civil rights activism?
Yes, I mean he's doing stuff with CORE. He's giving talks, but he's also then running back to Istanbul. So he's doing both. Their Life magazine and Time. He was on the cover of Time magazine in 1963. There's an article there. There's also Life followed him when he went down to Durham and elsewhere. So yes, he is very, very much on the road, but he's also incredibly exhausted because of it. So it's a perfect example of this kind of. He called himself a transatlantic commuter. That was his term because people would say, you're an expat or you're an exile. And he would say, no, I'm not. I'm a transatlantic commuter. I'm committed to the civil rights cause, but I'm also committed to myself as an artist and to sort of preserving. He was committed to preserving his own life as well.
And in 1963, he was 39 years old. The March on Washington. Here is James Baldwin talking about his participation.
For the first time in our history, and for the first time in 100 years, the nation shows some signs of really dealing with its central problem instead of, as it has done for 100 years, avoiding it, evading it, denying it, lying about it, pretending it did not exist. The country will have to now go to work, and very hard work, very dangerous work, to change itself, to achieve this dream that Martin was talking about. And if we do not achieve this dream, we have no future at all.
Do you believe we will achieve it?
I certainly believe it. I certainly believe it.
In a non-violent manner?
But yes, I believe that too. But it is going to cost us, every single one of us, including everyone here and everyone in this country.
Mr. Boggs, was James Baldwin allowed to speak on August 28, 1963, March on Washington?
According to the historians, no. According to historians like David Blight, according to David Leeming. But again, like many things with Baldwin, there's so many factors that went into this occurrence that it's hard to know why. Some people say, I think there's some truth to this for sure, that it's because of his sexuality. Bayard Rustin, was similarly kind of still involved, but he was sidelined a little bit. But also Malcolm X, I think, said something correct. He said that they didn't want Baldwin up there because they couldn't control what he would say. And Baldwin had in fact written a speech to be read there, and he had written it in France. He'd gone over to France for a march over there. These were Black Americans in France who were doing a march along the Seine in support of the March on Washington. And then Baldwin brought this speech with him. And the exact reasons and specifics of how this happened, we don't know. But somehow or other, he didn't end up reading it. But a very famous actor at the time, without saying that it was James Baldwin's words, read these words about Black global liberation coming out of the mouth of, you guessed it or not, Burt Lancaster.
And in that video that we just showed, James Baldwin was sitting there with Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, and Charlton Heston, all very active in the civil rights movement. of the time.
And Marlon Brando, right, yes.
In 1965, James Baldwin held debates with William F. Buckley. We want to give you a sense of what those debates, there were 2 debates, were like. Here's a portion.
It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skins, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime, so that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen.
I'm saying to you that the engines of concern in the United States are working. The presence of Mr. Baldwin here tonight is in part a reflection of that concern. You cannot go to a university in the United States, a university in the United States presumably also governed by the Lord Spiritual, as you are, in which Mr. Baldwin is not the toast of the town. You cannot go to a university of the United States in which practically all other problems of public policy are preempted by the primary policy of concern for the Negro. I challenge you to name me another civilization, anytime, anywhere in the history of the world, in which the problems of a minority, which have been showing considerable material and political advancement, is as much a subject of dramatic concern as it is in the United States.
Well, Nicholas Buccola has an entire book about Baldwin and Buckley, which is excellent, which I highly recommend. I think that this was a very important debate when it happened. I think it's in some ways become more culturally relevant now. I mean, because of YouTube and because of social media. What interests me though about it is actually to nerd out for a second a little bit, is something that hasn't been written about that much, and I only touch on it, is the kind of code switching that Baldwin was doing here. He was moving between the Black vernacular from the church into this kind of almost Queen's English, a kind of Black Atlantic accent that he shared in a way with other important Black cultural figures who spent time abroad, like Maya Angelou, even later on Tina Turner. So what it shows is the kind of pressures, but also possibilities that Black public figures face in this moment in order to reach multiple audiences, right? That's the idea that he's out Englishing the English is pretty amazing to see in those clips.
Was James Baldwin educated in college?
He was not. In fact, he graduated a kind of a semester late from high school. He was a brilliant student in English and history, but he graduated late in part because he was helping to support his family. He thought about going to City College, but he had to go and make money. So his father was ill and then died, and he had to help support his family. But so he didn't go to college. But of course, he's been schooling all of us in the world, for his entire adult life. He was an autodidact in some ways. You have to remember, but when he was 4 years old, he was reading the entire Bible. When he was 5, he was reading his way through Harriet Beecher Stowe. By the time he was 9, he was reading Dickens. He was reading his way through the Harlem Library and then through the 42nd Street Library. So he was a voracious reader and self-educated in that way.
What was his relationship with organized religion?
Very interesting and very complicated. His father was a storefront preacher, and Baldwin, when he was 13, became a preacher himself, in part kind of to usurp his father in a way at his own game. And he became kind of famous, somewhat famous in Harlem. But as he struggled with his own sexuality, he saw the kind of contradictions, the hypocrisy of the church. This is something he writes about in The Fire Next Time, but also fictionally in Go Tell It on the Mountain to great effect. He ends up sort of leaving the church in part because Buford Delaney, the painter, shows him this other way of being in the world, being an art. He saw that a black man could be an artist, but he never really left the church in terms of linguistically. You see it everywhere in his writing, but also that first trip south in 1957 that we talked about. This was the first time he met Martin Luther King for the first time and was back in the black church. And he realized how much he missed it, not necessarily in terms of the kind of explicitly religious aspects, but the kind of sense of community that he sensed there, the kind of love that he felt in that room, but also the potential for political mobilization. And this is really important. He understood that the black church was an engine of community and sustainability during the civil rights movement, for sure.
So, Nicholas Boggs, why did James Baldwin return to Paris 1970 or so?
Okay, so he had been in Istanbul for most of the 60s, and fascinatingly, he'd been in Hollywood trying to make Malcolm X into a screenplay for Columbia Pictures. They wanted to have Charlton Heston play Malcolm X, so it's not so different from this Burt Lancaster weirdness. And he once again attempted suicide. And he went back to Turkey and directed this incredible play, Fortune in Men's Eyes. His only play he ever directed, and had an incredible experience there. But once he finished that, it's almost like his experience in Istanbul had been consummated creatively, and he had to go somewhere else. And he was going through another breakup, and he was ill, and his Mary Painter, his friend, and also Baldwin's agent at the time, suggested that he go to St. Paul de Vence. He'd been there before, and he went and stayed in a hotel.
And that's in the south of France.
That's in the south of France. That's right. Not too far from Nice. And he stayed in a hotel, and across the street was a for rent sign in this beautiful property. And there was a pied noir, so a white Algerian woman who lived there, and she was a dyed-in-the-wool racist, as Baldwin called her. But she somehow rented a room to him, and as Baldwin was able to do, he charmed her they became, incredibly close friends, and he ended up, living there and then purchasing the property and called it Chez Baldwin. And it became, when he was younger, he had written to Engin Cezar, one of these amazing letters that he wrote from the McDowell residency, that his dream someday was to build a house by the side of the mountain or the edge of the sea where he could create his art. And he finally did that. He sort of did that in Istanbul, but this house in the south of France where he lived for, more than 15 years and where he died became this kind of sanctuary that he'd been searching for his whole life.
Now, Mr. Boggs, you said toward the beginning of our discussion here that J. Edgar Hoover was rather voyeuristic in his monitoring of James Baldwin. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, those are Baldwin's words in The Devil Finds Work. I think he called him something like the greatest voyeur of all time. Baldwin understood, I think, probably that J. Edgar Hoover himself had a ambiguous sexuality, and that Hoover's, and scholars have written about this, Hoover's interest in Baldwin was very prurient in a way, right? He didn't want his own sexuality to be exposed, but he got a kind of perverse pleasure in kind of unmasking Baldwin's. You can see in this, in what he wrote about him. He said, he's not sure that he's a pervert, but he might be. So in a way, it's almost like Baldwin was reflecting back aspects of Hoover's own self that he didn't want to be publicly known. But they consistently misunderstood Baldwin. At a certain point, they really thought that he was aligned with Elijah Muhammad. He wasn't. Baldwin did greatly admire Malcolm X. I mean, I think when he decided to do this screenplay, that was a tipping point for them, where they became very worried. Baldwin also said at a certain point in an interview that he was writing a book about the FBI that he was calling The Blood Counters. Now, there's no evidence in the archives that this book exists. So, Baldwin had a sense of humor. He would also say in letters to people, if you try to call me in the U.S., call me at this number. A family member will probably answer and say hi to J. Edgar at the same time, because he kind of knew that his phone was being tapped. Having said that, it's worth underscoring that this was very stressful for Baldwin. Even in the 70s, when he was no longer being followed, he would sometimes have to drink scotch just to get on an airplane because he was still afraid. Remember, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, Baldwin justifiably feared, and his family feared, that he was next.
Does Shea Baldwin still exist in St. Paul de Vence?
Sadly, no. There's a long, sad history about a legal fight that unfortunately it's been turned into condominiums. I'm sure Baldwin would have a very vexed and lacerating essay to write about the fact that that happened. He wanted it to be turned into an artist residency because artist residencies like Yaddo and McDowell had been so important to him. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. However, the writer Jacqueline Woodson has created a residency in upstate New York called Baldwin for the Arts. So there's a way that his legacy lives on in other ways through artist residencies.
5 months before his death, and this is from your book, Baldwin, A Love Story. This is James Baldwin writing to a friend, July 4th, 1987. Well, I certainly effed up often enough, and my hopes seem frequently to turn to ashes and poison, but I don't think I have any real regrets. It's awful, not to say awkward, that it takes so long to learn so little, but there's nothing anyone can do about that. Why did you include that in the book?
I included it because there's, for many reasons, I mean, but one of them is that there's this narrative of Baldwin's life that I tried to kind of cut against in my book. And it's one of both this decline, that his powers as an artist declined, but also that he lived this life full of tragedy and suffering. And yes, of course, there was a lot of that, but he also, through these relationships that he forged, he had a life full of joy and community and love and eroticism. And I wanted to capture that in the book. And I also would say, he died way too young. He was just 63. He lived I think the stress of his life contributed a lot to that. But that, I think when he died, he was at peace with himself and peace with his accomplishments. And I think David Leeming and his brother, who were both down during those periods, said that it was in a way a good death. He was surrounded by his brother, was with him. The love of his life, Lucian, was there. He was in this place that he loved in St. Paul de Vence. And, he had, I think he recognized what he had achieved. And I think that he had come to peace with himself more than anything else.
Mr. Boggs, did Baldwin leave any unpublished manuscripts?
Oh, he sure did. I mean, what he was working on at the time of his death was a play called The Welcome Table, which has never been published yet and was never really performed. And it is a fascinating play, sort of based on his time in St. Paul de Vence. It's about an aging diva, a woman singer, but it's based on himself. And there's a character very much based on Henry Louis Gates, a reporter who shows up. And there are ex-lovers who show up who are definitely reminiscent of Lucian and Joran Kazak and others. And it's really about this aging diva grappling with her later life and with fame and with being an expat or a transatlantic commuter. So that exists. He was supposedly working on a novel about Buford Delaney that I have never been able to find. And there are drafts of a novel called No Papers for Muhammad. His gardener was named Muhammad, Algerian gardener, and it's a fascinating archive there because there are all kinds of different essays and novels and works that kind of grew out of it. That's how Baldwin often worked. He would be working on one piece, and then out of that would come a novel and an essay and then another novel. It's just the way that his creative process worked. So he had a lot brewing during those later years. He really did not, even though I said he was at peace, he did not want to die. He understood that he had a lot more work to do.
Baldwin is the name of the book. A Love Story is the subtitle. The author, Nicholas Boggs. We appreciate your spending an hour with us.
It was great to be here. Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us on the Q&A podcast. Next week, we talk with Air and Space Museum curator Teasel Muir Harmony and the history of the space program.